We are so delighted as alums of Arizona State University to be able to come back and share a bit of wisdom with you and also learn from you, as we did yesterday in the pre-conference workshop and hopefully in our conversation today after we talk for a bit. We're going to kind of do something a little unusual that Kathy is going to describe in just a moment. But did want to say that our talk really is building on what we talked in the pre-conference yesterday about finding voice. It's really about validating your experiences as graduate students, helping you find the language to name what's happening around you, think about strategies for change, and help you know that you have some agency either to make change or to find support if you're in a situation where inequality persists and you want to find some folks that will work with you to kind of cope through that, strategize through that, and make some change. So thank you again for having us.
Yeah, and as Kelly said, I want to, I'm also very grateful to be here and to be in this space, particularly with graduate students, near and dear to both of our hearts in terms of education. And when Kelly and I were invited to co-present as keynotes, we're trying to think, like, are we going to do this serially? Like, you're going to get up and speak for, 15 minutes, and I'll get up to speak for 15 minutes, then we'll have a Q&A session. And what we really wanted to do was something a little bit different. And the way that we're framing it is that we're going to be talking about finding voice and dialogue. And so we want to sort of model, in some ways, kind of a dialogic experience for both of us. So just a little background on Kelly and I. We were both here at Arizona State University, and we were graduate students at about the same time. We were working on different spheres at this university on different projects. And we actually, although I had applied for a position that Kelly vacated when she went to University of Michigan, I actually was a program coordinator at the Intergroup Relations Center where she had worked. We had never actually met each other. And so when she went on to University of Michigan and I was at the IRC, we participated to work with the University of Michigan on to launch a large research grant and project across 9 universities on intergroup dialogue. And so we met as a result of some of the PIs putting together teams. And when I first met Kelly, I was like, oh yeah, you're Kelly Maxwell, and you're Kathy Wong. That took my position. So we have a long relationship, and we have co-presented for workshops across the country, probably like every other year, or once a year or something, we'll find a conference that we feel like we can present at together. And so we have somewhat of a history with each other. Yeah. So I'm going to start our conversation a little bit to let you know about sort of my history. I'm a native of California. I grew up in Oakland and Hayward in the East Bay in a working class family. I'm somebody whose family wanted me to do higher education, of course. My parents had immigrated here. I'm the child of immigrants who came in the 1950s. And I had a very strong voice. I grew up in a working class neighborhood where having a strong voice was not something unusual. I grew up in the 1960s in a neighborhood that eventually became a union neighborhood because many people were able to get union jobs. And so for me, my voice was very strong. I grew up in a neighborhood where if someone thought you did something racist, they would just call you a racist, and there might be some expletives laced in there, and you would defend yourself, and then at the end of the day, you had an argument, but the next day you were still neighbors and you worked together, right? In the ways that you could, even though you might be a little bit wary or whatever. But it was very direct, very much say what you mean, or tell people you can't say it, right? So you don't sort of avoid, you sort of say, no, I'm not going to tell you, end of story, right? So 30 years ago, I was a union butcher in Oakland. I was a woman who worked in a butcher shop with 8 other male butchers. And it was a traditional one where I broke down beef and used a bandsaw and had a very sort of working class experience. Previous to that, I've been a community organizer working for a TRIO program in the community in San Francisco, working as a bilingual counselor with Southeast Asian refugees. And so I had an activist background as well. And then my voice then was really important. When I first came to Arizona State as a grad student, so I went and did my bachelor's late at a regional university in California, because I realized that if I were to leave butchering and go into nonprofits, I was limited because I didn't have a bachelor's. And so I did my bachelor's at the ripe old age of 30, and went off to graduate school at 32. When I first got to Arizona State, I remember being really shocked at how quiet and silent it was. When people were in conflict, people wouldn't speak. And that was really stunning to me. So my story of voice is kind of coming from a working class background that was not accustomed to middle class, I would say, politeness and quietness that permeates a lot of our organizations. It was a shock to me. So my voice was actually learning how to tamp down and not like blast people out of their seats by saying, okay, well, I think that was really racist, right? The first time I said that, people went, oh my God, did she say the R word? Right? So that's a little bit of my background, just to sort of start the conversation of where I'm coming from and where I traveled through my education.
And I think I had quite a different experience finding voice. So I grew up in a small town in Ohio, a middle-class experience where I very much tamped down my voice before I ever learned to have a voice. It was a very gendered experience where women weren't suppressed in their voice, but the men really had the final say in my family and kind of in my town. And you were talking about some of those middle-class communication style. I think I learned a lot about that, just to be silent. I also grew up in a mostly white town, and so it was a very colorblind town. We didn't see color, and as long as we didn't see it, then everybody was treated the same, right? And so I learned also not to notice difference, even though, of course, it was quite apparent when there was difference, because it was quite unusual in a fairly homogeneous town. So it really took me going to college. I went to a small liberal arts college in Ohio to begin to find my voice and to begin to learn that it was okay to speak up for myself and speak up against injustice when I saw it. And that's what I learned to do through the educational experience that I had. It was only later when I came to intergroup dialogue and other kinds of diversity work that I actually began to unlearn that systemic colorblindness, to begin to understand my whiteness and the power that it had in many rooms. And so I had to sort of mediate this finding my voice finally and being able to speak up, but then also listening, learning to listen and encourage the voices and experiences of others who had never had that opportunity to speak their truth as well. So it was kind of a real balancing act for me, learning to find my voice and listening to the voices of others. And I did that primarily, again, through intergroup dialogue. And so today we're going to be talking a lot about how we learned to communicate through the lessons of intergroup dialogue. So I want to tell you a little bit about what is intergroup dialogue, so you have a framework and understanding of where we are coming from. So intergroup dialogue is a particular kind of methodology and pedagogy that brings roughly equal numbers of two different groups together, a group with power and authority in society and a group with less power in society. So roughly equal numbers of, say, for example, people of color and white people. Roughly equal numbers, for example, of men and women and non-gender conforming people. So balancing power in a room where outside we don't experience power balancing. It's also facilitated by a member of the higher power group and lower power group. So two facilitators are coming together to help lead the conversation that is sustained over time. Now, at the University of Michigan, that means a whole semester. Sometimes we did it here at Arizona State University for 6 weeks. So, but over time it's sustained, and it follows 4 stages. The first stage is really learning about what is this thing called dialogue. How is it different from debate, winning an argument? How is it different from discussion, where everybody kind of says a serial monologue of something that they want to say? Dialogue is about seeking to understand other perspectives. The second stage of dialogue is kind of learning the language of inequality, because intergroup dialogue is about understanding structures of inequality and how those are impacting these two groups that are coming together to talk. So telling our stories, learning about our social identities and the impact of socialization on our lives, understanding privilege and oppression. And then the third stage of dialogue is actually digging in and engaging in sometimes conflictual conversations about topics that are relevant to these two groups that are dialoguing. Relevant, but oftentimes viewed from very different angles from these groups that are coming together. And then finally, the fourth stage of dialogue is now what? We've been through this process together. We've built some kind of community. And now, are we going to stay in coalition together? What is my responsibility to you, to your group, to my own group? Where, have I found my voice in this process? What are the next steps? So I wanted to kind of lay out that framework before I ask this first question of Kathy. And I think I can see if it'll. Oh, there we go. So we have built in some conversation questions that we're going to have together, but we will also have time at the end for you all to ask questions and be in conversation with us and with one another. So, Kathy, you talked about having a really strong voice and needing to mediate that a little bit when you came into the academy. What did you learn about using your voice and also learning from others in the intergroup dialogue process?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, it's an interesting question. So I participated in the formal program of intergroup dialogue where you have this sustained conversation. Then I ended up being trained as a facilitator and then eventually ended up joining the Intergroup Relations Center and actually training facilitators. So I had a lot of opportunities to participate, and I recognized that the process of going through this, being a participant, being trained as a facilitator, and then training the trainers or training the facilitators, that this dialogic approach was starting to, fortunately, bleed into the rest of my life in terms of my work life and home life and other sorts of things. And one of the things I think that I learned was the importance of understanding socialization. So when we're looking at dialogue, we really look at sort of how did we all get to where we're at in this room right now in dialogue, right? So I remember in my earlier years of my graduate program being in courses or being in seminars where I'd be so angry because, I'd be reading this research and go, this does not apply, I'm sorry, to people who are immigrants or the children of immigrants or people of color, period. This was probably done, I'm guessing, on middle-class white families, maybe possibly at a university in the Midwest somewhere, possibly, because a lot of it didn't apply, right? Maybe not even to working-class white people. And I would be just so, just angry, and I would be, saying something, and not that it's wrong to be angry, but I would not be able to get my message across. And part of it was my personally just feeling like I was so excluded and wanting to, in my mind, even though I wasn't saying it intellectually, I would blame other people, right? Mm-hmm. Really angry at the professor, angry at some of my classmates. But what intergroup dialogue taught me was that if I really believe that we arrive at where we are because of socialization, because of the curriculum that we're exposed to or not exposed to, because of the ways in which popular culture, the media, politics influences the way that we relate to each other, why am I surprised that people arrive at this dialogue not understanding who I am. Why am I surprised when people stereotype me as an angry woman of color? Why am I surprised that I have this sort of knee-jerk reaction and I get triggered when other people speak, right? And so the thing that intergroup dialogue taught me was how to scaffold what I'm saying and thinking and what other people were saying onto structures and historical discourses and communication, so that it would, for me, help me speak from a position of strength, to be able to critique and not personalize that critique. And that was really a valuable skill that I still use today. So that's one of the most important things. So it didn't blunt my voice, it just helped me contextualize my voice in a way that I value to this day, and I try to teach other people to do. So I would say that's probably one of the most important things that helped me contextualize my voice. And so I still have a strong voice, but it's tempered by an understanding or a scaffolding on sort of the larger dynamics, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me that too, understanding socialization was really important for me, because it helped me understand and own why I hadn't learned a lot of things growing up. But intergroup dialogue also gave me a language, a common language around social justice that I had been feeling, but not really understanding how to articulate. And so some of the concepts that we talk about in intergroup dialogue really resonated and were able to give me some language to speak with other people who were similar to me, but also people who were different and who had different social locations as I did. So I think that was something that really helped in the intergroup dialogue process, and still does, as you say, kind of scaffolding now that I work with facilitators or trained facilitators who then work with intergroup dialogue students, kind of getting everybody on that same page with some common language can really be helpful in the dialogic process, because we don't have to always agree on the definitions, but at least we kind of have a sense of where we're coming from.
Yeah, and I like the way you talk about naming, because I think it's naming that, like when I'm talking to Kelly, I'm not just talking to Kelly, I'm talking to Kelly in front of this group as a woman of color to a white woman, right? We're of a certain age, we're older than you are. There's all these sort of power dynamics and things that I think I found myself more comfortable to name over time, because that's sort of part of the methodology of facilitating intergroup dialogue, is to really clarify for people what is actually going on here and how do we struggle with the dynamic that we inherit in our relationships that are a part of even our personal relationships, and to not always just focus on the personal. Because if you want to change, the intergroup dialogue model is a model of social change and social action at the end, right? When you decide to, when you can connect in a way that's meaningful to form alliances, you want change not just at the interpersonal kumbaya level. You're trying to do systemic change, right? And so if you don't have your eyes on sort of the system, any action that you do is just a one-off, like a good feel-good project, versus something that's actually addressing what are the policies that recreate this situation. What about future situations like this? What do we do? How do we marshal resources? Who else needs to be in the group? Who's missing? All these types of things are really something that I think are valuable in naming, so that you can have a real good meta conversation about these issues and not just the actual problem. We tend to do this, graduate school teaches you to have this laser focus. Intergroup dialogue teaches you to have that as well as the larger systemic focus simultaneously, holding both of those simultaneously in your head, right? Yeah.
Shall we go on to the next one? I think it ties right in about using voices given the salience of our privileged or oppressed identities. And I think we both already, in sharing just even where we came from, shared a little bit about the salience of those identities in our lives. Would you like to speak to that?
I'm going to start by opening with a question. How many people have been in a situation where you know that you're knowledgeable and capable. You know that you're in another realm outside of academia. You're seen as a strong person and a leader, and then you get a glimpse of yourself from other people in your program or at your institution that is totally in contradiction with how you're viewed in other places. Anyone ever had that experience? Mm-hmm. Okay, right? Mm-hmm. So this notion of privilege and oppression is it's a very hard concept to tackle with your brain, I think, on a feeling level, right? Like when I came into graduate school here, I entered as a master's student. I did a master's/PhD program. I came in not understanding the extent of how my oppression experience within this context would go. Because I had come in being a very capable person. I'd done a lot of great community work. I had a really huge impact on a lot of people's lives that was really positive. I was recognized for my work, working as a bilingual counselor in a federal program. I had all this sort of, in my mind, capabilities, right, that gave me the courage to come away to Arizona to go to graduate school and leave California. To arrive here and have people see me a different way and get messages in a different way in graduate seminars and other places was kind of stunning to me. I remember thinking, oh, so this person thinks I'm less than. Dang, right? This is not who I am, right? So, but what was important for me was to recognize that what I was interpreting was a personal understanding of myself. There's a difference between understanding a systemic understanding of yourself. Right? And so for me, my voice, I had to exercise my voice in a way that acknowledged that. I'm not just who I think I am. I'm actually, social identity is socially constructed, right? It is a negotiation constantly. And that negotiation can get very exhausting. It was very exhausting for me when I was a graduate student. But at the same time, I was able to articulate that, I felt like, from a position of strength, saying this is who I am outside of the academy. And this is who I think I am in the academy, but it's in contradiction with how I'm being viewed. And so I would actually voice that, and that was, I think, sometimes threatening to some people. At the same time, I remember people would come up and say, I'm really grateful that you were able to say that. I'm going to think about that. I felt threatened, but I'm going to think about that. So I think voice coming from an oppressed position or a less privileged position can be sometimes very disempowering. But I want to encourage those of you who find yourself in those kind of experiences to really try to evaluate yourself in different contexts, right? So the criteria by which you're measured in higher education is very narrow. That's the purpose of higher ed. It's the purpose of PhD programs. You know a lot about a very narrow bit, and that's what you're getting evaluated on. There's this other realm of all the other things that you are and all of your being that are important for you to maintain in terms of a sense of who you are. And finding your voice to be able to do that, to bring those aspects of your leadership, of your, passions, of the insights that you have is incredibly important, because that's what the academy needs as well in order to be more inclusive and to have voices that really populate our institutions, that represent different perspectives. And at the same time, that also makes space for you to open spaces for other people who are still missing from the academy, right? So it's so I would say that was a very hard struggle for me coming up as a graduate student.
And I guess I would add slightly differently. The intergroup dialogue process was really impactful, as I said before, in finding my voice as a woman. But it was very much about understanding that it wasn't just me as an individual woman, but that there were structures in place that viewed men's voices differently in the academy than women's voices. And that allowed me then to also sort of shift and look at my whiteness from a different angle. Because as I came to understand my voice as a woman in a less privileged identity and understand the privileged side of gender, it allowed me then to kind of renegotiate and re-understand in a new way who I was as a privileged person, someone who is white, also coming to this context. And so knowing that those intersectional identities are at play, and then also invisible identities. Will I be out in this space? Will people see me as someone who is credible because I am a lesbian as well? And do I share that? Do I not share that? And the intergroup dialogue process for me was one of building trust over time. That's the whole purpose of the arc of dialogue, is to be able to listen to people's stories, but to also find my own voice to tell my narrative, and to tell not just this slice of the narrative, but maybe a larger slice of my narrative, and have people validate that, take it seriously, and find something that they too can connect with. And that's what I also did by listening to others. So absolutely understanding ourselves as individuals, but within this context of structures was really, really crucial, I think, for me in finding my voice, but also then beginning to trust that I could be someone who had something to say here, and then also trusting that others could find their voices as well. And I think that connects maybe
To the next question, right? It should be.
Yeah. What does trust look like
In communicating
in
with others.
communicating with others? For me, it was, I thought of trust for very many years as interpersonal. If you just share with me and I share with you, then we will build this bond together. And there is an element of that. Of course, I need to learn how to listen and communicate one-on-one. But I think I also began to understand that this trust process was interwoven with who we are as members of groups. And so trust wasn't just something that happened, because there are long histories of mistrust or broken trust with people who look like me in terms of my whiteness. Or maybe there are measures of mistrust around gender, that I needed to get through, that it wasn't just one-on-one with someone, but in fact there's that layer of identity and structures that goes underneath the surface of kind of that interpersonal trust.
Yeah, I would say trust for me as someone who has often been in marginalized positions, and I think for other groups as well. Trust for me is I'm going to trust you if we can go through, I don't have to like you and you don't have to like me, but if we can go through conflict and at the end of the day you still respect me and I can respect you even in the heat of conflict, that's when trust is going to come. So it's a very different basis. So it's not based on liking. It's not based on niceness. It's based on, are you somebody who's truly inclusive and respectful of the different paths that people take and the positions they have, even if they're oppositional to yours. That opposition might be historical, right? So you may get benefits and privileges that you had nothing to do with creating, but yet you benefit from. And I may be in that same position not being advantaged. And if we can't talk about that in a way that's respectful and meaningful, then that trust is not going to be there for me, right? So I want to talk about a lot of the research, for example, on social support or on building rapport on teams and stuff, is based on this sort of you're taught to sort of like when someone says something, you're like, oh yeah, me too, and you're told to sort of look at something and make a link, right? So to express similarity. Well, when you start doing research that's purposefully integrated if you have like a mostly white group and a couple of people of color, and someone says something that happened to them and everybody says, yeah, yeah, me too, me too, do you think trust goes up for those people of color? Why not? Anyone want to guess? Why doesn't it go up? I'll give you an example. Let's say I say, gosh, you know, sometimes I have such a hard time when I am traveling, like through the Midwest. I get nervous when I'm traveling by myself in a car. I have a rental car. I'm on a road in the middle of nowhere. I'm concerned about my safety even though it's broad daylight, right? And let's say I share that, and then someone else in the group who's white identified says, yeah, I've traveled in Mexico and that's happened to me. It's just, so they're making an attempt, very nice attempt to try to connect with what I've experienced, right? But my trust will go up, will start diminishing. Why is that?
Because they're not making a point of listening to you and your specific experience.
Right, so first of all, they're not seeing sort of the structural reasons for why I might. And then their effort at me too becomes a centering of them, right? And so a lot of the research that's been done on how to build rapport and stuff was really done with homogeneous groups. In actuality, careful disidentification and good listening and asking people and for details that are different, kind of going, oh yeah, I didn't know that, is actually what trust building is more like. It's a lot more complex, right? And so for me, the trust has to be that I've given you an opportunity, and we talk about these issues, and you actually hear and you don't shut down, right? Or say that, oh, that's not really what happened to you. Mm-hmm. Right? Or I'm sure that people didn't intend to do that. That wasn't their intention. Those kind of things, right? Where you're actually saying to people that they didn't experience what they experienced. And so trust is a complicated thing in community building. And it's not that you can't make mistakes, but you have to be able to talk about it. Right? So you have to do the meta communication about it. Mm-hmm. So that's where trust comes for me, is being able to have those honest conversations, right, with people.
And yet we know that we work with people all the time who we don't really trust, right? Who have good intentions and are folks that want to work well with us, but are the folks that are saying, oh, me too, I have that exact same thing, and so the trust isn't there. How do we engage with those folks? We still have to, right? We still have to work with folks that we haven't built that kind of extensive trust. What are some strategies that you use in working with people who, are not as trustworthy?
Yeah, I try to, so that's a good question. So I try to do the scaffolding. I try to, and I do a lot of meta talk, about. So I'm going to, and I just had this kind of conversation last week with somebody. So I'll say something like this. I'll say what I said last week. I understand that you came to my office and you were asking for help and you explained the situation to me. You asked me for my opinion. I think the opinion I gave you and the interpretation I gave you for suggestions is not what you were expecting. So you're disappointed, I think, right? So I'm going to talk about this again, and then I start scaffolding it on. These are the reasons why your student might have interpreted what you said for these reasons. And in fact, it's not unusual. It would be very unusual if your student, in this case happening a Latinx student, did not interpret it that way. In fact, I think that if you had a room full of 30 Latinx students, probably 25 of them would have been interpreted this way. So this student's not unusual, right? And here are the reasons why. And I know it sounds kind of, I'm not critiquing you, but I'm giving you an interpretation because I'm actually interested in helping you. And I know that you're coming, kudos for coming to ask for help because you're concerned. And I know that you care about the institution, right? And I know very much that you care about your teaching. And so I do this sort of, cognitive empathy, but very, very direct, like sort of saying, this is who I think you are. Here's the reason why I think you came. These are our common goals. And then now let's talk about the details that are different. And that's hard. It's sort of balancing that, right? So it's and showing that a commitment that I'm concerned. I do care. So I do want to make a statement. Just because I don't trust somebody doesn't mean I'm not going to work with them. I'm committed to the enterprise of higher education. I actually believe people can learn. Regardless of how set they are in their ways, I believe there's a possibility. And I will do everything I can to provide the circumstances for that person to learn. Now, it can get to the point where they're not going to and they're very resistant, then it's good. I've done my best, right? So I try to make a good faith effort. So I would say that's how I try to, you know.
And I heard in that the framing of the connection that we're doing the best that we can for our students, that you care about what's happening in your classroom, you know, that way to make the connection, but then also how we diverge in what we're saying. I was also thinking about socialization. We talked about that before. And seeking to understand. I think that's really an important piece of dialogue. And when I don't agree or can't get behind somebody's perspective, I think for me it's about learning more about where they're coming from. Why are they having this resistance to something that's happening in their classroom or to a particular student or to me? You know, where is that in their history? Did we get to this point today when we're interacting? And so it's that perspective taking, as you were saying, cognitive empathy. So how can I really figure out what is going on and try to understand where that's coming from? That doesn't mean to excuse it or to say, well, then we just agree to disagree or something like that. But I think I am better able to connect with someone if I understand more about where they're coming from. And that can be really, really tough when I absolutely disagree with their position. But if I know a little bit more about how they came to that position, and they know a little bit more about how I came to my position, then perhaps we can meet a bit in the middle where we can still be open enough to learn from one another. So I too don't feel like we have to trust in every situation that we're working together, and yet we can still work effectively across different ideologies or different perspectives by seeking to understand. So where are we? Yeah, let's go.
The next one. Does the dialogue process still work when power differences exist? What do you think, Kelly?
Thanks. So, you know, Kathy and I are now in positions where we have some authority and some power, and so it's a little bit easier than when we were graduate students to kind of use dialogue skills. And yet, I think we both believe very strongly that dialogue skills, regardless of the power at play, are effective because of empathetic listening, because of perspective taking, because of seeking to understand. Of course, we are hoping that people are meeting us with those same types of kind of communication framework, but sometimes that isn't the case. And so we have to think about building coalitions. We have to think about gathering support and not necessarily having a one-on-one conversation, but having a facilitated conversation where we can balance the power a little bit more. Part of intergroup dialogue is about balancing power structurally, because as I mentioned, it's roughly equal numbers of people from different identity groups. It's facilitated by 2 people from each of the identities coming together. Now, when you're talking in you know, a graduate program with all of these faculty, there isn't a balance of power. We can't pretend that there is. But are there some dynamics that we can think about that will tip the balance a little bit, and really kind of challenging ourselves to do that can help us think about using dialogue in that way.
Yeah, so like, for example, the balance of power between graduate students and faculty, particularly your faculty advisors, right? It's a huge power imbalance. And so it does help to try to change up those dynamics a little bit. And there are several things you can look at. The setting, is it a territory that's more student-driven or owned versus faculty-owned? So you might want to have a meeting that's not in your department area, but to have it in a place like here at the student union, for example. Faculty may feel threatened if they're just picked off by themselves, and so maybe one or two or three, maybe 2 or 3 faculty, but have a larger number of students, right? So because of the power difference. So you can do some things to make it so that it doesn't equalize it, but it makes it, it maximizes the power being less, different being closer, right? And you can't ever sort of remove it totally. So you can do a lot of things. There was this contact hypothesis research that's pretty compelling on how you look at the setting and the circumstances and the validation of that meeting. So you can get the chair or somebody, and maybe someone from the graduate college or your graduate student association to sign on saying that they sponsor the meeting, something like this, right, where it's condoned by some sort of group that are leaders, and then have it so there's these things you can do to set up so that you can up the outcomes a little bit so that they will be more egalitarian. It's never going to remove all of it, but to be really sort of careful to think about that in terms of trying to maximize the situation. The other thing is that sometimes, the power differential can be abused by the other person, as Kelly has said. So you can do all your good faith, empathizing. I do want to say something about empathy. Cognitive empathy is not about feelings. It's about intellectually understanding where people are coming from and why they might think and feel the way they do. It's not this kumbaya, like, oh, I feel so sad for this person. In fact, I might feel like, I don't feel sad for this person at all, but I'm going to try to understand who they are. And that way, when your feelings come, they're attached to some data. They're attached to a perspective. It's not just this blind feeling sort of just like floating out there, right, that doesn't really help in terms of your processing and stuff. So there are times when I have been in situations where it's clear to me that person is about sort of just like, staccato talking to me and not returning empathy, not wanting to listen to me. And I will still, in a very mechanical way, give them cognitive empathy. So I can think of a situation where there was this chair who was standing over me, taller man, just like barking at me, and I didn't back up, and I kind of looked straight at his chest, and I got out a piece of paper, and I said, okay, so what you're saying is you're unhappy because, and I just kind of listed the things very calmly, right, as he's like going on and on and on. And I said, so is this clear? Have I gotten that? I want to make sure I got what you're upset about. And when you've calmed down, we can sit down and talk about these issues, right? So cognitive empathy, again, is not necessarily this touchy-feely thing, right? It's giving people letting them know that you've heard them, and so that you don't want yourself to be a doormat when there's a huge power differential as well, right? So, yeah.
I also wanted to give an example of a time where dialogic practice worked when there was some imbalance of power. I was working with a STEM department at the University of Michigan last year, where the graduate students had really come to their chair and then come to the associate dean and said, we're just not listened to, we're not getting the mentorship we need. When we're teaching assistants, we're not getting the proper support from our faculty, on and on and on. The chair was very concerned, and so I have to give him credit for bringing in a team of people to help think about this. But my piece of this was to engage an organizational change process where we had graduate students and faculty come together in kind of a dialogue process where there were graduate students, more graduate students at any given table than there were faculty. They were given a topic of, like mentorship or student stipends or, whatever the various topics were that the graduate students had raised, and really thinking together. So they were doing a task together to think about strategies that could be improved, to improve these various graduate student issues. And in the process, of course, hoping that the faculty would be listening to the graduate students. And so we balanced the power by kind of imbalancing, giving more voice to the graduate students in that space because, in fact, they have less voice usually in those spaces. I did have several senior faculty who happened to be white and men who were very, upset with this process and that, it's just, what are we doing? Why are we talking to each other? But they directed it at me, not at the graduate students. So, I can take it. It doesn't matter. There were no consequences for me. And I just said, you know what, I want you to engage in this round because we were going to do multiple rounds. Stay at your table, listen to the graduate students, engage. And you know what, if you can't do this, then you go on and leave after this round. And kind of dismissed him. And it turns out he stayed. He wasn't fully present and he wasn't fully engaged, but he stayed and he listened. And I felt like that was a little bit of a victory in that moment. The other thing I did, which I don't do all that often, is use my body for power. I'm very small, short, and this faculty member was sitting when he was kind of giving it to me about this silly process. And so I stood over him. I rarely have a chance to stand over anyone because I'm so short. As you were saying, this tall man was standing over you. But I used my power in standing in this situation to project some authority. And that wasn't a dialogic move by any means, but it was about power and it was about authority and being able to kind of use that in a scenario that I felt was important to show where my voice was in this. And so I don't always recommend using that, but sometimes you have to if folks are giving it to you, thinking about how you can meet them at the power play that they're trying to make with you.
I think the other thing I want to mention is how many people have been told, or you tell yourself, that you microanalyze everything and you're overreacting because every single interaction you're trying to figure out who's in the room, who are they to me, what is our power difference, what do they actually mean? How many people do this?
I do.
All right. Don't let anyone tell you that you should not do that. All right? Research shows that people who are in marginalized positions, who sometimes have a foot in several cultures or in several communities and struggle, are the most likely to be able to think in cognitively complex ways in problem solving, and they're most likely to be innovative in solving complex social problems. So it's actually a gift to be able to do that. I know it's exhausting, but don't let anyone tell you that it is not a good thing to do that. That is actually something that is valuable. So people that are migrants, people that grow up multilingual, people who are the children of immigrants, people who live as a minority amongst the majority, all of those folks are more likely and more easily can do these kind of things. And I think we can think about that in intergroup dialogues.
For sure.
That these students are often the ones who are they can actually identify other people's perspectives, sometimes before the people themselves are able to articulate them well, because they're in the habit of doing it to survive, right? As well as to analyze. And so it's something that, that you can be denigrated for, but this is a really important skill in terms of success in organizations.
So some of the things that we are just talking about are benefits of dialogue, but before we list those out, we also wanted to just name that there are critiques of dialogue and get those out and talk about them a little bit. We feel like we can respond to those critiques. You may still have them after we name them, but then we will also talk about some of the benefits of dialogue. So shall we move to these?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first one is dialogue is just talk, right? It's just talk, it's not action. Words don't really change people. It's not going to change the circumstances. It's kind of like, you know, in those old Peanuts or Snoopy cartoons, you know, it's just wah, 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 you know. It doesn't really matter what people are saying, right? How many people have heard that before? Why do we spend all this time talking, right? Okay, because it's not going to change anything. You ever heard that before, right? Well, I mean, to respond to that is that, you know, we have this gigantic, robust series of studies out of this large intergroup dialogue project across 9 campuses that we did with tens of thousands of participants. It was a large research project with pre- and post-tests and post-post tests in terms of survey instruments, and then a lot of qualitative research and analysis. And what we found is the process of engaging in dialogue actually changes people's understanding of who they are, not only in relationship to each other, but in relationship to society, right? And some of the outcomes that are really incredibly important is 18 months, the post-post surveys were 18 months out? 18 months out, right? Students are more participatory in nonprofits, in public and civic life. They're thinking about society in a more complex way. When they answer a question such as, you know, what are the causes of poverty, they're less likely to make it a character one, but to actually think of systemic issues, right? About resources, about the ways in which society is organized. So they're making more complex understandings of how inequality happens in our country. And these learnings stick, and this is through the process of dialogue. It's not that we're not like trying to wash people's brains, you know, do brainwashing and tell them, you know, you're even all wrong about society. It's the process of engaging with each other and then scaffolding on understanding how we arrive to where we are, right? And so the findings are actually very robust. And one of the fears we had was, and this was hard because we got like a $3.1 million grant, and it's like, what if at the end we find out that one of the things that we were worried about is that white people or white women learn at the expense of everybody else, right? What if people of color, students of color, get nothing or very little out of it? But what we found was that every group had significant gains on all of these measures: public participation in civic life, understanding about social inequality and economic inequality. A lot of things, those outcomes were good. So it's not just talk. That's a long answer for it's not just talk. But yeah.
And the research behind it.
Yeah, the research behind it. Very compelling
Yep.
research, yeah.
Another thing is dialogue means everything and nothing. So small d dialogue has been taken over. Oh, we're going to have a dialogue. We're going to talk about this. We're just going to be in conversation. And so I can understand why people feel like, well, it really doesn't mean anything because it's just talking. And it kind of bleeds back into the one before. It's just talk. But in fact, the kind of dialogue that we are speaking of is for social transformation. Capital D dialogue, intergroup dialogue, is that which helps people take other perspectives. It gives particular skills around responding to people, listening to people, sharing your narratives, perspective taking, and understanding issues of inequality. So in fact, it is very specific in what we're talking about. But I do think the term itself has gotten watered down somewhat, and in everything is a dialogue. But in fact, we're not seeking to understand in all of those spaces. We're having a whole lot of discussions that we call dialogue, which are really just a series of people giving their perspective on something without deepening it or finding where there are commonalities, where there are differences, and interrogating those as we do in a dialogic space. So I think the term dialogue may mean everything and nothing, but we think intergroup dialogue in particular, and the particular kind of dialogue that we're talking about, actually makes a big difference.
Yeah, and the key to that is trained facilitators.
Yeah.
Right, who push people when they say things. They'll say, okay, tell me a little bit more about that. So when you say this, what do you mean by that? And they make each other make students interact with each other, for example. The next one is wastes valuable time and delays decision-making. Well, it can delay decision-making because people are exploring and understanding a problem in depth, right? And so what's important is to know that that journey is really important, right? So dialogue kind of, instead of being this upside-down pyramid, when we think of decision-making models, it kind of goes like this and it goes way out here, right? Then you start, people are thinking, oh my God, what about this, what about this, what about this? But that journey is really important, because when you start then narrowing down as to what action you're going to take or what a solution might be or what the problem actually might be, you have a background understanding of all of the related issues, people who are stakeholders, all different types of background, and so it makes you think in a very complex way. And so that delay in decision making is really important. Now, in times of crisis, it is very hard for people to think that we need to take the time to do this, but it's really important to do it, right? Not like a crisis of material proportions, like if there's an active shooter or something. I'm talking about that. I'm talking about like a crisis where, for example, there might be a racist incident on campus and other types of things. When you've taken care of the safety issues, like with policing and criminal sort of issues, the important part is to take the time to actually do these facilitated dialogues so that you can come to understand how are different communities affected, how are we not thinking about things we're thinking of as a one-off rather than a systemic issue. Right, so.
Now, there are people in power who will like to use the term dialogue to do nothing, for status quo. And that we have to push back against that. So that's not what Kathy is talking about. But it does happen. You know, let's form a committee and we'll have dialogue, or let's have this forum with students, we'll hear them out, and then, and then it's summertime and we don't have to do anything. So, I think it's okay to be wary of which kind of dialogue are we really talking about. Are we talking about the dialogue that's going to expand our thinking around the possibilities for change, or are we talking about dialogue for the sake of status quo? And that's not the kind of dialogue that we're talking about here, but it is something that I think to be thinking about, listening for, which kind of dialogue are we really talking about here?
Right, so if you hear people say it's a pressure cooker, we're just to do a pressure release, right? It's a release valve, right? Then that's not a dialogue. That's just to get people to sort of feel like they've said something, and hopefully they'll all feel better and they'll go away, right? But the problem still remains, right? So, yeah.
Kathy already touched on dialogue is mostly about emotion and not critical thinking. So again, that cognitive empathy is not really just about our emotions. It's really about understanding things in a more complex way. By sharing our narratives, which can elicit emotional reactions, at the same time, we are broadening our perspectives. Because if we've only had our own one personal perspective and experience, and haven't heard all of these other ways of looking at a single issue, that in fact is going to give us a way to critically examine an issue in ways that we had never before. So don't fall into that trap of dialogue is only about emotion. Now, we do talk in intergroup dialogue about connecting the head and the heart. It is very much about bringing emotion into the room, but it's for the purpose of expanding what we know and expanding how we know it. And so it's not just to get stuck in emotion, it's to really bring ourselves as whole people to complex topics.
And the last one is, I don't think we need a lot of discussion on it, is dialogue is very gendered. It's a sign of weakness. And this most often comes from people who are in leadership positions, right? Sometimes many people identify as men who are in leadership positions will see talking as a sign of weakness, of dialogue, of invitation for people to disagree with you as a poor sign of leadership. And that's really based on an authoritarian model of leadership, right? What I say goes, and I'm the decision maker, I'm the wiser one. It's very paternalistic, somewhat colonial, right? I'll say it. And so actually, it takes a lot of strength to have dialogue. to have the courage to open up and say, you know, let's talk about this. And some of those things may hit me the wrong way, and some of those things might question what I've been doing and what I've been leading. But because I care about the quality of the work that we do, and that it's important to have everyone at the table, I need to have the courage to open that up. And so, in fact, it's the opposite. It takes a lot of strength. I mean, I don't want to say gendered, being female or woman-like or feminine is a weakness or something like that, but that's sometimes the assumption in our society. But it's actually a strength, right? It's a tremendous strength, right? And newer leadership models actually see that, right? The people that are capable of dialogue and dialogic leadership are actually are far more skilled, right, than people that are authoritarian. Yeah.
So we want to kind of move then to maybe benefits of dialogue.
Or not.
There we go. Right. Benefits of engaging in dialogue. And what do we mean by dialogue in these contexts? So purposely facilitated. I gave you that example of me working with the STEM department. It was facilitated by me so that I could help to balance the power in the room. I could elicit the voices of those with less power in the room. It's important to have dialogue be facilitated, maybe if it's a one-on-one conversation and you're using dialogic techniques. That's not as much of what we're talking about. But when we're in a situation where there are multiple perspectives on the table, multiple people involved, it can really help to be facilitated in order to kind of get the benefits of some of these other things. It's process-oriented. So the outcome is about understanding. It's about making better decisions because we have more information. But how we get there is just as important as what the outcome is at the end. So it's very much about how we ask the questions, who we are engaging with, what does that look like so that everybody is here at the table and has equal voices. That doesn't happen in a lot of conversations, and so that process orientation is really important. It is also about relationship building. So sometimes we get so goal-focused that we just want to solve the problem at the expense of the relationship. But in fact, dialogue brings us together because I am learning about your narrative, you are learning about my narrative. We are understanding each other in a deeper, more textured way that allows us to come to that better decision in the end. And then next time, it'll be easier to work together because I know more about you. I've developed a relationship that can continue. So dialogue is very much about relationship. And that then leads to organizational capacity building for social justice. When I know you, it's a whole lot harder for me to dismiss what you're saying. And so if we can build on those connections that we make in understanding each other in dialogue, we can lead to better, more socially just outcomes. And we do that through taking people's perspective, through empathetically listening, using that process orientation to really fully hear and understand someone, not just, again, moving to the outcome. There we go.
Yeah, and some more benefits of engaging in dialogue of the type that we're talking about, right, is that it encourages more complex thinking. So I've talked about cognitive complexity, or what we call in cognitive science integrative complexity. So that means that you can hold contradictory information simultaneously in your head and not make decisions about the value of different ones immediately. so that you can actually come to understand the complex background and interactions in any sort of complex social problem. And so the ability to do that goes up as you take on and understand multiple perspectives, right? So an individual that is constantly, over time, seeking alternative perspectives from their own, even if you don't agree with them, so it's not like you're trying to be persuaded by other people, but you understand them, you are more likely to have that higher order level of thinking when you're addressing complex social situations. And so we can't tell ourselves to be cognitively complex. And doing all these brain exercises that you see all these companies that are giving you is not going to make you do that, actually, in complex social situations. It's actually perspective taking, right? And it's this, so it increases your cognitive complexity. Listening, of course, is essential, and listening is really, it's hard. It's really hard. So it's really having good faith listening, even when you're sort of feeling like, ugh. Like I do that sometimes. I'll be in a meeting, I'm like, did they just say what they just said? You know, and then I I have to remind myself. In fact, I'll grab a pencil or pen and I'll do, okay, I'm going to write down what this person said so I can clear my mind and get to it, because in the end, that information might be really important for me to be able to show that person that I heard them, right? And then subverting the dominant narrative in decision making. It is, so when we perspective take, we can also perspective give on behalf of other people, right? So when you practice this, and as a facilitator, as well as like in the type of situation Kelly was in, or any of the facilitated dialogues I've had during a crisis, right, situation on our campuses or on other campuses I've been brought out to, what I can do is sort of say, okay, so what I heard, although it was a minor perspective, but I know because maybe some students weren't comfortable coming into the room or on any given campus, here's a perspective that I think someone mentioned about 5 exchanges ago, right, that I think is actually directly counter to what you're saying that you think students think. There's evidence, right, here's all these different perspectives, let's talk about that. So it's important to create the language and the structure through dialogue to be able to do that, to identify dominant narratives, but also identify alternative narratives that are probably actually more true to some extent to a population that's being impacted, right? So having that ability to talk at a meta level is really important to identify those dominant narratives. Naming the impact of inequity identities, I sort of talked about that a little bit just in that last example. And then in research, the lenses we bring are valued. So when we're talking about like what you're doing, your research projects, your dissertation projects, the things that you might be doing in the community, it's really important to facilitate discussions and insert your perspectives on the topics that you're studying, you know, the inequities and the gaps in the literature that you're trying to fill, you know, maybe the mismatch of what theory is not really informing your study, that this is what you really want to do with your study, here are the reasons why. Being able to articulate that and to draw on the perspectives of other people's work is really important. So I would say that dialogue has taught me, when I'm reading through literature and stuff, I'm always thinking about what is the perspective of that researcher? Why did that researcher do this research? What is their theoretical perspective, right? And so that's an important way to sort of think. Perspective taking in policies and decision making, sort of the same thing, right? What was the motivation for this policy? It might have been a good motivation, right? But the person didn't have the perspective to understand the impact. So the example that I like to use sometimes is about housing, for example, a policy on how students sign into housing, okay? So on most campuses, you have an early bird deadline with deposits, and then you have a later one, right? And people with financial aid, of course, can't make the first one usually. The deadline is made without any thinking about people that have less resources, right? And so what happens is you end up segregating housing because you let people choose what buildings they want to live in, right? You can let people choose their roommates, but you don't sort of say that the fourth, you know, that this person, this registration that comes in goes to building A. The next registration goes to B. The next goes to C. The next goes to D, so that you are equitably putting people in. Now, the people who designed that policy, they probably weren't thinking of economic segregation and racial segregation, right? But their perspective was they didn't think about the economic impact because they haven't had that experience themselves. Maybe they weren't on financial aid. They didn't understand. And the people that are getting segregated don't understand what happened to them either. They just kind of feel like, oh, how come all the poor people live in this building, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's just, so there are things that we can do when we are in an area where we can make a decision. We can ask that question, gee, I wonder how this affects people with students with less economic ability. Have we thought about that? Right? Or we can ask the question, do we privilege people that live 30, 40 miles out versus other people, and who might those people might be? Who might they be in terms of, in comparison to other students? So again, perspective taking can really help in terms of policy making and perspective giving of other people's perspectives too. Yeah.
So we have been getting the 30, 15, and 5-minute mark, and I think we are about at our time. We had some other lessons learned, but I think it's good now to open it up for your questions, your conversation with us and with one another. We hope this has given you some nuggets to take away and think about dialogue in the spaces that you're in, thinking about perspective taking, thinking about your identities and the role of structures in the way that you are interacting in your grad programs and on campus generally. But let us open it up to you for more conversation.